walk us through the history of the Billboard Hot 100. How did they start measuring this, back in 1958 when they started it, and how do they measure it today?
Billboard magazine, as the name suggests, I think it was launched in 1894. It was a magazine that covered, I would say, broadly advertising, things that people were posting on flyers and billboards and stuff like that. Slowly over time, they started to cover more things related to entertainment. And then I believe by like the 1930s, they were exclusively dedicated to music. But it was ultimately, it's a trade magazine, and it still is to some degree. I mean, they're dealing with pop stars, so there is some crossover appeal to your average person. But a lot of the stuff in Billboard magazine is stuff that only people who work in the music industry would care about. So it's pretty natural that they would try to launch a chart, something informational for people in the industry. They want to see everyone wants to know what's selling. For decades, they had tons of different little charts that tracked specific things like, oh, these are the most played songs in jukeboxes, because this was a long time ago, or these were the most sold in stores, or this was the most played on radio. In 1958, they decided, you know what, let's take all the ways people listen to music, create some formula, and decide or measure what the truly most popular song or songs in America are within a given week. So every week they would publish this list of 100 songs. It would take in, at the time, like I said, it was mostly record sales, radio, and jukebox spins. As formats evolved over the years, Billboard would start integrating those. So, as cassettes rolled out, or as the CD came about, and even more stuff like I mentioned earlier, ringtones were very popular in the 2000s. They would count ringtones towards the Hot 100. Now the Hot 100 is mostly driven by streaming. So it's the same in name, but it's a very different document, because for a long time it was largely driven by what people were going out and buying, but now it's mostly driven by what people are consuming or listening to. So it's sort of measuring a different thing. The equivalency back in the day would be, how many times did you play that CD you bought, rather than just how many times did you buy it. They still are tracking physical sales and stuff like that, so that stuff all still counts. But most people listen on streaming, so that's going to drive what gets to the top of the Hot 100 these days. And if a new format arises, I'm sure Billboard will try to capture that too.
What did you use as your data framework when you started researching this? Obviously, you have the list, but you kind of got to gather up resources everywhere else. So, how did you start building out the framework so you can start analyzing this at a deeper level?
Yeah, this was another thing that generally evolved organically. When I first started making this spreadsheet, which it's publicly available. I'm happy to send it along to you if you want to share it with anyone. But at first, I would listen to these songs with a friend, and we'd both rate the song out of 10. And I was just tracking our song ratings. But then I was like, maybe I'll pull in a little bit other information, like who wrote the song, what label put it out, how long is the song, really basic facts about these songs. But then as I was listening, I would feel like I was noticing something. For example, in the first chapter, I felt like there were lots of songs about people dying, which I thought was very odd for very popular music. So then I would go back and I would be like, all right, let's fill in this information. Let's decide, let's look at the lyrics and say, how many of these are about death or dying or something else? And then suddenly I had a new data point. And because I established that, as I would go forward, I would only listen to one song per day. I would always fill out that data point. So as I became interested in stuff, I would just add more and more columns to this data set. And because of that, I was able to track some interesting or weird things that would be hard to measure if you were like, all right, I have a list of 1,100 songs. I want to track how long the introductions are. It might be tricky to figure that out if you weren't sitting down very slowly and listening one by one every day. But because of that, I was able to just track things over time as I was interested in them. And occasionally I have to backfill the data, but still.
How can the data around music inform us on culture, right? So you're looking at these long stretches of time. You're looking at number one hits, right? But the amount of music that we are producing is incredible. And the amount of music catalog over time, it's an immense data set. And that's too much for any person, maybe even any company to research. But what can the data around the music industry inform us about culture?
Usually things that become very popular, first of all, they're part of a larger movement. I talk about in this book related to surf rock, which was popular for a couple of years in the 60s. There were some surf rock songs that got in and around the top of the charts. But if something gets to the top of the charts, it's usually indicative of a larger musical style or cultural movement. So we can see what's going on in culture widely just by looking at the most popular records. But music often just reflects there is a, I guess, a two-way relationship where, people, popular culture influence the music that comes out. But music also seems to influence how people behave in some degree, or what people think about, or how people speak. Here's a funny example of that. The term YOLO, which was popular probably about a decade ago,
My college self is, yeah, I'm harkening back here.
that was from a Drake song. From the Drake song, The Motto. Very popular song, not a number one hit, but had an impact on, the words that people were using. In the same breath, like I said, it can go the other way too, where, and this is a weird example, but in the 70s, there was this there was a streaking trend. People would run around, like, streak on football fields. There was a streaker at the Oscars in the mid 70s. Like, this was a thing, and I don't have the information about why this cropped up, but naturally there was then a number one hit that was released, or a song that was released that got to number one, called The Streak by a man named Ray Stevens, who made like novelty comedy records. It's a horrible song, but it's a good example of like something's going on, and like some musicians like, oh, I'm going to try to capitalize on this, or I'm going to react to this. So it goes both ways, I think.